All right, good evening, everyone. So this is continuation of chapter 9, lifespan development. And when we last left off, we were actually on this slide. Let's see here. Hold on one second. Problem already. And we had left off, we had talked about reflexes and sensory abilities of newborns. And this was actually the slide that we ended on physical development. And we're really still talking about infants and newborns and infancy, right? So also just a reminder, if everyone could just please make sure that you are muted unless you're going to ask a question. That way it just prevents some ambient background noise. Thank you. And all right, so when it comes to growth in infancy, hold on one second. All right, and so we had left off on this slide. And so we're going to talk about a couple of things from this slide, right? First, and I think many people know this, if you've ever been around an infant that grows into a toddler, you know, during infancy, growth is pretty rapid. They get big pretty fast, right? And this continues on through, you know, being a toddler, and then around ages 4 to 6, it kind of slows down, and then, you know, at ages 8 and 9, roughly for girls, you'll see a growth spurt, and then the word that's missing here is boys. Will experience growth spurts around age 12, and moving forward from there. And then when it comes to their nervous system, there's a couple of terms that I kind of want you to know. And actually, these two terms that I'm about to talk about, you'll hear me talk about again in chapters 15 and 16 when we talk about therapy and other mental health concerns, such as, for instance, schizophrenia, for example. So how this all ties in, I'll share with you in just a moment. So with the nervous system, there's a time period, it's called the blooming period. And this is where there is literally an explosion of new pathways that are formed. Remember earlier when we were talking about language acquisition, and you watched the video with Elizabeth Loftus, and I've also made, you know, remarks, not very clinical or scientific, but I call kids little sponges, right? Because they're observing and taking in everything. And all of this stimuli is being processed in their little brains. And the most neural pathways that we have are actually in our earliest years, when we are in the first part of our neural development. And thousands of new connections are created during that time, right? So that's the blooming period. And then there's a period of time known as the pruning period. And this is where neural connections are actually reduced during childhood and adolescence. And actually, pruning actually continues on close to probably into your early 20s. And your brain actually does not mature, is not considered fully mature until around age 25. And pruning is part of that maturation process. And what pruning is when neural connections are reduced. In other words, unused neural connections over time. Once you go through the blooming period, you're not using all your neural connections. They're just not needed as much. And so part of that maturation process is that there's pruning. Now, how does that connect to schizophrenia as an example? So I attended a conference in Denver, probably 4 years ago, and I attended a presentation on the latest neuroscience regarding schizophrenia. And one of the things that they found, the way pruning works, is there are actually enzymes in your brain that break down these neural connections. Very similar to the enzymes that break down excess neurotransmitters. Remember, when the neurotransmitters are in the synaptic gap and they attach to the receptor sites, causing neurotransmission. What happens to the neurotransmitters when they've done their job? Well, they kind of float around in the in the synaptic gap, and one of two things happen to them. They either get reuptake as a whole molecule back up into the presynaptic neuron to be repackaged into vesicles, or they are broken down by enzymes and then reuptake occurs, and then they're repackaged into neurotransmitters and stored in vesicles, right? And so what the research has found is that there could possibly, one possible cause of schizophrenia may be the over pruning of neural pathways. Now, this is just a hypothesis that they're looking at. What they have found is that individuals with schizophrenia, when they've tested them, have an overabundance of these enzymes, and this is just kind of brief. So you'll probably hear me talk about this again. And since it came up here, I thought I would kind of introduce the idea of how sometimes things can go wrong, unfortunately, right? Remember last class, we talked about the teratogenic effects, right? And a teratogen is like alcohol or drugs or a disease that causes problems to an unborn fetus, right? By getting into there. So these are just some things that could go wrong, right? And then there is motor development, right? And so we have motor skills, right? Which is the ability of our bodies to move, manipulate objects, things like that. And as the child is developing, these motor skills actually kind of occur in a very orderly sequence, and they become more advanced as the child grows and is practicing their motor skills, right? And so there are two types of motor skills, and I'm going to talk about gross motor skills first, even though this is kind of out of order a little bit. But gross motor skills are those that focus on like large muscle groups, control the arms and the legs. They control larger movements, balancing, right? And then there's those fine motor skills that focus on muscles like in your fingers, your toes, your eyes. And what the fine motor skills do is they allow us to coordinate smaller actions, like grasping a pencil is the example that's listed here. You will see some questions that will be focused on these terms on the exam as well. All right. And then as we continue on with cognitive development, now we've already kind of like talked about a lot of this already, right? So last session we talked about Piaget and excuse me, and his cognitive theory of development. And he basically thought that children's ability to understand objects develops slowly as the child matures and interacts with the environment, right? So that was his belief. Now, today, psychologists think that Piaget was incorrect. And I'm going to show you a video here in a little bit about some studies on object permanence. but the studies show that very young children understand objects and how they work long before they have experience with those objects. And infants, observing a truck rolling down an unobstructed track, rolling down a track with an obstruction, right? And then rolling down and pass through what appeared to be an obstruction. And infants spend a lot of time looking at the last item, right? The rolling down and passing through what appeared to be an obstruction. And when they looked at that, what it suggested was that they understood that solid objects really can't pass through each other, right? So that was kind of some of their observations. So let's watch a little bit of study on object permanence here. Let me see if I can, I might have to do it once I start it. Let's see here.
At the University of Illinois, a team of researchers is now using ingenious experiments to discover previously unsuspected abilities of newborns and young children. Professor Renee Beyer-Jean studies how babies develop the concept of object permanence.
By object permanence, we mean really a set of beliefs about objects. The first and most fundamental belief is that objects continue to exist when hidden. The first person to investigate the development of object permanence beliefs in infants was Jean Piaget, the famous Swiss psychologist. And he claimed that it's not until approximately 8 to 9 months of age that infants understand that objects continue to exist when hidden, and that it's not until approximately 12 months of age that babies begin to understand that objects not only exist but retain their physical and spatial properties when hidden. What we've done is to devise a series of tasks where the infant simply had to look at possible and impossible events.
In this experiment, a 6-month-old baby watches a cart rolling down tracks, going behind a screen and coming out the other side. The screen is lifted to show a block sitting behind the tracks. Next, the baby sees the block placed on top of the tracks. The screen comes down, the cart rolls exactly as before. But in the real world of permanent objects, the block should have stopped the cart. The baby stares longer at this apparently impossible event.
When infants are surprised or puzzled by an event, they tend to look at it longer. So our prediction is always that if infants perceive the events as we do, then they will look longer at the impossible or magical event than at the possible event. And what we found is that infants as young as 3.5 months of age, and perhaps younger, but certainly as young as 3.5 months of age, understand that objects continue to exist when hidden. One contribution of this research is to say that we must really take a very close look at infants' physical knowledge. It's much richer, much more sophisticated than used to be thought.
At the University of Illinois, a team of researchers is now using ingenious experiments to discover previously.
All right. So that was actually a video demonstration of the research that I was just talking about, which is really interesting regarding, like as she said, that the infant's knowledge is actually a little bit more richer and more sophisticated than we originally, or Piaget originally thought, or that we originally understood as well. So, although it is still fun to play peekaboo with a very young infant. All right, let's see here. Here we go. All right. So now we're continuing on with cognitive development, and we're going to start talking about some cognitive milestones. And the word milestone is another term that I'm going to want you to kind of be able to know and to be able to recognize for the exam. And so milestones are basically those ages when most kids are experiencing these developmental achievements, right? So for instance, between the ages of 6 and 9 months, that milestone, they can shake their head no. Between 9 and 12, they respond to verbal requests like wave bye-bye, say hello, right? At 8 months, they understand object permanence, right? So that's when they begin to understand that. And then toddlers understand someone will come back when they leave the room, and will look in appropriate places when asked to find objects. And we did see a short video in the last class that kind of that described object permanence, although it wasn't with a toddler, it was with a much younger child who really hadn't developed object permanence as of yet. And then between the ages of 3 and 5, they learn to count, they name colors, they become more curious, they start asking why, which could be a fun age. And then 6 to 11, thinking becomes more logical, it becomes more organized, they can actually plan, they understand the past, the present, the future, and they also understand cause and effects relationships. And then attention span generally is limited until approximately age 11, when they can have the ability to increase their attention span, even if it doesn't always seem like it. All right, before I move on, any questions on cognitive milestones or object permanence, or any of the physical development items that we had first started talking about? And remember, if you don't have a question now and one comes up, you can always put it in the chat or just shout out professor, and then we'll stop and take that question. All right, so the next section we're going to talk about is attachment. And attachment is basically, it's a long-standing connection or bond with others. And when it comes to psychosocial development and psychosocial milestones of infancy, forming healthy attachments is one of the main tasks, right? So how do parent and infant attachment bonds form? How does that happen? How does neglect affect attachment or these bonds, right? What accounts for children's attachment differences? And so some of the most influential studies were conducted by Harry Harlow, who we're about to talk about, John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth. So in the Harlow experiment, and you can find some, I believe I might have a video posted on this. You can also Google it. I didn't want to take up too much time. I have some other videos coming up during this presentation. And so this was one I chose not to show. But in the video, if you look it up, it will show you their experiment. And what they did was they put newborn monkeys from their mothers, they separated them, and then they presented them with 2 surrogate mothers. One of them was made, well, they're both made out of wire, but one was covered with like a soft cloth and, you know, was warm and soft for the newborn monkey. And then the other one, and by the way, the soft one could not dispense milk, could not provide food, right? It was just a soft, warm cloth. And the other one was all wire, right? Not so soft, not so comfortable, but it had food, right? It had a milk bottle. And what they found in the experiment pretty consistently was that the monkey spent time clinging to the cloth monkey, but only went to the wire monkey when it was hungry, right? When it went for food. And so what they say is that this suggests that feelings of comfort and security are critical for that mother-infant bonding, right? And that newborns are actually, that's what they're looking for. That was the Harlow attachment experiment. And then Bowlby defined attachment as an affectional bond, or affectional, I'm sorry, bond tie that the infant forms with the mother. So there's affection involved, and the bond must be made with the primary caregiver in order to have normal social and emotional development. And Bowlby saw attachment as an all or nothing process. So they either had it or they did it, right? And also came up with the idea of what's known as the secure base, right? So in other words, having the parent present gives the child a sense of security or the child's sense of security as he or she explores his or her surroundings, right? So they can go off and do their thing, but sometimes in these videos, you'll see the child every once in a while turn back and check, is the parent still around? And that's known as the secure base. And then some of the requirements for healthy attachment is the caregiver must be responsible to the child's social, physical, emotional needs, and that the caregiver and child must engage in mutually enjoyable interactions. And there are some really cute videos out there of mothers and babies having these enjoyable interactions, right? The coochie coochie coos and all of that kind of stuff. And then Mary Ainsworth asked the question, basically, or was trying to answer the question, do children differ in the way they bond? And if so, why does that occur? And so she looked to answer this question through a procedure known as the strange situation. And some of you may have heard of this, but this is where the mother and the caregiver, the mother and the infant, I'm sorry, are placed in a room together with toys, right? And I'm actually about to show you this experiment. And a stranger enters the room and then the mother leaves. And then after a few minutes, the mother will return to the room to comfort the child. And through this strange situation, she discovered actually 4 styles. That's a type, I'm sorry, 3 in the beginning. There's a total of 4. And we're going to review each of these in the slide following it. But it's basically secure, avoidant, resistant, and disorganized. And like I said, we're going to review these in more detail after the video. So let's go ahead and watch the video of the experiments, or the strange situation, I should say.
Studying attachment is not straightforward. One way is to observe the children in the home setting relating to mother, father, or other children. But can the essential elements of home life be translated into a standard laboratory setting for controlled scientific study? After conducting extensive observations of parents and children at home, a student of Bowlby's, Mary Ainsworth, devised such a procedure, called the strange situation, which places the child under some stress. It has become the most widely used standardized way to assess the quality of a child's attachment to their caregiver. Here the researchers are recording how 14-month-old Lisa responds in this attractive but unfamiliar setting. How will she react to a stranger? What will happen when her mother leaves the room and when she returns? It's Lisa's behavior when her mother returns, what psychologists call the reunion, that they are particularly interested in.
Most importantly is to look for the type of balance that a child strikes between an attachment need and, on the other hand, to explore the play material.
Once Lisa has settled down to play, a stranger enters the room and sits in the chair reading a magazine.
Lisa, where's the bow? Where's the bow?
After a couple of minutes, the stranger attempts to interact with Lisa. Soon after, Lisbeth gets a cue to leave the room. The stranger tries to comfort Lisa, but in vain. Lisbeth comes back into the room, and the camera records how Lisa reacts. Now the first part of the procedure is over, and Lisbeth settles Lisa down again. The stranger leaves them alone together. And soon after, Lisbeth goes too. Lisa is on her own. Her distress is plain to see. Once again, the efforts of the stranger to console Lisa are to no avail. But Lisbeth manages to calm her almost at once, and shortly afterwards the observation ends. Lisa showed outward signs of what's called secure attachment. Can these signs give us an idea of what's going on inside the child's mind? John Bowlby used the idea of an internal working model to describe this. Howard Steele, another attachment researcher, explains what this means.
Some people express the internal working model in the following terms, that the child who behaves securely, if you like, in the strain situation, has a model of the parent as available and loving, and a complementary model of the self as worthy of that love.
When data from a number of strange situations are coded and analyzed, secure attachments are usually found in about 60% of the cases.
Seem to be quite nice.
Another child, 1-year-old Eva, clearly behaves differently from Lisa during the first part of the procedure, after she's been left alone for a short time.
She's first glancing at the mother, and then glancing again at the mother. I would expect now that she would seek proximity, a little bit distracted by the stranger. This takes a long time before she's oriented the mother again, isn't it?
Although she looks, but only shortly.
She's clearly distressed, so you would think that she would seek proximity, but she's just...
She remains playing with the ball.
Yeah. So more or less focused on play material, and not letting her emotions go and seek proximity to the mother and get a reassurance.
Coding and classifying behavior in the strange situation is not always straightforward. Eva behaved differently in this second reunion to how she'd done in the first.
A lot of attention for play material, so I was stuck with a little bit of...
Some of her reactions show signs of what Ainsworth describes as insecure avoidant attachment.
On the other hand, fuzzy.
How are avoidant attachments represented in the internal working model?
This is a mother who has communicated to his or her child, if you're distressed, try to keep grips on it. Try to have a stiff upper lip. Try to pull yourself together. Try to be independent. Try to learn to deal with it on your own.
Although the strange situation is used extensively in attachment research, some other psychologists who have studied children's relationships have reservations.
I think the problem is making inferences about the relationship from how children behave in the strange situation, because it is exactly that, a strange situation. Because the tricky thing is, what does the situation mean to the child? It means something probably very different for a child who's been in daycare since early in the first year, and the same is true for children from different cultures, for whom this experience may have very different meaning again.
Despite such criticisms, this 20-minute strange situation procedure is still widely used and believed to indicate the relationship between the child and, in this case, the mother. It is considered to highlight important qualities of the attachment and show significant links with other aspects of the child's experience and behavior.
The child's representation of his or her relationship with mother from the first year of life carries over to the child's behavior with peers at 2, 3, 4 years of age, such that children who look securely attached in the strange situation to mother at 1 year are getting on better with peers in the preschool, able to work cooperatively on tasks, resolve dilemmas, conflicts that emerge, often without resorting to the teacher.
Studying attachment is not straightforward. One way is to observe.
All right. Okay, so let's look at the different attachment styles, right? So first there was secure, which was kind of demonstrated in the very beginning, right? Where the child uses the parent as a secure base from which to explore. Talked about that in the previous slide. And in the experiments, those that were coded with secure attachment, the child was distressed when the mother left, happy to see them when they returned. And the hypothesis behind this is that this is common when caregivers are sensitive and responsive to their needs. Then we have the next one, which is avoidant attachment. And this is usually linked to an unresponsive parent. The child does not use the parent as a secure base and does not care if the parent leaves. In these cases, the child is slow to show a positive reaction when the mother returns. And this is common when caregivers are insensitive or inattentive to the needs. The third one is resistant. And in this case, the child is going to show like clingy behavior and then reject the mother's attempts to interact with them. So it's kind of like, come closer, stay away, come closer, stay away. In those situations, what was observed is the child really didn't explore the toys, became extremely disturbed or angry when the mother left. And when the mother returned, the child was not consolable or more difficult to comfort, right? So they stayed disturbed and angry even after the mother returned. And what is deemed to be common here is when the caregiver may be inconsistent with their level of response, right? So they might be sensitive and responsive in one situation or sometimes, and then at other times they're insensitive, inattentive, and confuses the child. And then the fourth one is disorganized. And this is when the child may exhibit some odd behavior around the caregiver. And the observations that were made was they behaved oddly when the mother left. So they either froze or they ran around erratically, trying to run away when the mother returned. And this is linked when the child has been abused. So these are the theories. And then you also saw in the video that there is some criticism to it, right? That there could be some cross-cultural differences, things that we have to keep in mind. Also, like she pointed out, the experience of the child maybe being in daycare or something, from an early age. And then, of course, her saying, how it is a strange situation. How do we actually really know what the situation means to the child? So those are all some legitimate criticisms and some things to show, to explore. One thing I will say about the strange situation is it is one of those experiments that has been repeated over and over and over and over again. And so where the criticism may be true, for some of them, it may not be true for all of them. And there does seem to be some evidence for these different attachment styles. Now imagine, as the child grows up, how that affects relationships in the future. Whether if they're secure, avoidant, resistant, or disorganized in relationship. And when I say relationships, I'm talking about like intimate relationships, intimate partnerships, husbands, wives, domestic partnerships, right? And that's regardless of sexual orientation, by the way. So this can have long lasting, or, this can carry into adulthood, in other words. The other thing about...
I actually have a question about
Sure.
the attachment styles.
All right, let me go back. Go ahead.
So, if, for instance, the child had like autism or another like developmental disability, would that affect their attachment style? Could a kid perhaps be like a resistant attachment style, but have like a sensitive and responsive parent?
Yes, and that's a great question, and I like how you're thinking about that. And here's what I will say about that, because I'm not an expert in autism. And when it comes to autism spectrum disorder, empathy, being able to play, understand what others are experiencing is kind of lacking, right? So that this may not translate well to there. And so remember, in this chapter, and for most of the chapters, unless we're actually specifically talking about a DSM-5 diagnosable mental health or disordered concern, we're really talking about, on average, the average individual not impaired by those concerns, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just wondering if there had been like any studies or anything with like non-neurotypical children, basically.
Yeah, and you know what, my bet is that there has. I unfortunately am not familiar with any, but I bet you there has been. So especially since children with autism, there are treatments available that had to have been studied, right, for some evidence-based practices, things like that. So I'm sure there's a body of research out there for that. It's a great question.
Yeah, actually, early detection will be better because the kids can start doing a lot of the cognitive. They can start doing better in speech and behaviors and all this stuff.
Yeah. All right, very good. All right, so now we're kind of moving on to like self-concept and social behavior. And of course, self-concept, another word for that is self-awareness. And, and it involves the positive development or the development of a positive sense of self. And that is the main psychosocial milestone of childhood, right? So a child with a positive self-concept they tend to be obviously more confident, more independent. They do better in school. They are more willing to try new activities. And if you recall back to the correlation isn't causation video that I showed at the very beginning of the semester, and that was one of the research items that, I can't think of her first name, but her last name is Sheets, was presenting in that TED Talk. She talked about developing self confidence, right? And remember, she was talking about, do the grades make the person more self-confident, or does the self-confidence make the grades better, right? And correlationally, what they determined is that children that have a positive self-concept, they're more confident, they're more independent, they try new activities, they're the ones that are ending up getting the better grades. And that it's not the better grades that are making the children more confident. In fact, those that were, if you recall from that video where they talked about this, that where she talked about it, I should say, that the kids that really had that self-confidence instilled in them, but weren't encouraged to do anything, academically, scholastically, athletically, creativity, right? That they ended up having worse outcomes later on, because they had all these this self-concept, but then they didn't really accomplish anything, and it had a detrimental effect, right? So but anyway, so that is an important psychosocial milestone in childhood. And by 18 months, a baby can recognize themselves in the mirror. And then by 24 to 46 months, they can recognize themselves in a photo. And then children display increased social behavior after establishing their self-concept, right? So ages 2 to 4, children enjoy playing with each other, right? They can label themselves as boy or girl. And through play, children explore and come to understand gender roles, which we will be talking about in the next chapter. But this is where they begin at ages 2 to 4, when we begin to really kind of understand gender roles. And then age 4, they can cooperate and share, they can initiate tasks, they can carry out plans. And then by age 6, they're able to identify themselves or see themselves as members of a group. All right, any questions on this before we move on? Now this is an example of how, remember how I said sometimes in these chapters, things we talk about, like, oh yeah, duh, that totally makes sense. And then when you get on the exam, it's like, oh wait, what was it? So this is one of those good examples, because everything here on this slide, I'm sure everyone's going, yep, totally makes sense, I get that. This part's easy. So just remember, you want to focus on reading your questions slowly and making sure you understand what the question is asking. All right, let's talk about parenting styles. And there are 4 types of parenting styles. And actually, I'm going to show you a video in a minute. But because I'll just give you a little heads up, because I think it's going to cause me copyright issues later when I'm trying to process this video, I'm actually going to stop recording when I play the video. We'll play the video and then I'll start the recording again, if that makes sense. That way I don't have to cut it out later. The other videos, I don't think I'll have any problems with. But let's talk about parenting styles. And so the development of healthy self-concept can also depend on the parenting style of the caregivers. And so here are 4 that are described. So there's authoritative style. And in authoritative, this is where the parents give children reasonable demands. They're consistent with their limits. They express warmth and affection, and they actually listen and consider the child's point of view, and that is authoritative. And then there is the authoritarian style. And in authoritarian, that's where the parents place a high value on conformity and obedience. And these tend, in an authoritarian style, tend to be very rigid, maybe not express affection. They provide little warmth to the child. They're just not as affectionate. So this is another example of where if you're reading really fast, you can easily make a mistake with these two when answering an exam question, because authoritative and authoritarian, very close in spelling, correct? But they are two very different concepts. And then there's the permissive style, right? And this is where the parents make very few demands, rarely use punishment. Oh, let the child be the child. They can do what they want. So there's not a whole lot of boundaries. The child can, that can affect them in their inability to understand another person's boundaries, right? So it can cause them problems outside the home as well. Actually, all of these can. And then the fourth one is the uninvolved style, where the parents are kind of like indifferent. They're like, they're uninvolved. Sometimes they may be referred to as neglectful, although, yeah, they're neglecting the child's needs. They don't respond to their needs, and they make relatively few demands. So those are the 4 different parenting styles. And so I'm going to stop the recording here because the next slide is going to have the video. I'll play the video. It's from that 70s show. The title is right here. And I'm going to play that, and then I'll pause recording. So Kitty, the mother, what parenting style do you think she was trying to demonstrate in that particular clip? What do you guys think? We already know.
Authoritative.
Yeah, she was trying to be authoritative, right? And of course, obviously, Dad being authoritarian. And when is he happiest? All right, well, I'll tell you when he's happiest. He is happiest when things are going his way, right? When he thinks he has everything under control, when he is being strict and has that tight grip. Yeah, so anyway, kind of a funny clip to kind of demonstrate the authoritarian, which you got a good dose of, and a little bit of authoritative that she was trying to demonstrate there with them. So, all right. So then the next section, and I'm sure everyone has heard of the word temperament, right? And so one of the ideas here too is that parenting style can also be affected by the temperament of the child, right? So temperament is basically those innate traits, those traits that come from within, that influences how one thinks, behaves, and reacts with the environment, right? So everybody sitting in this room right now, well, across Zoom land, has a temperament. So an easy temperament is demonstrated with like positive emotions. They adapt well to change, capable of regulating their emotions. In other words, they don't fly off the handle, for example. And when the child has an easy temperament, the they are likely to elicit from the parents warm and responsive parenting, right? So, and then if the child has a difficult temperament, right, they have negative emotions, they don't like change, they have difficulty regulating their emotions, they are more likely to evoke irritation and cause the parents to withdraw. All right. So any questions on temperament or parenting style? Excuse me. All right. All right, let's move into the next section, which is adolescence. And with adolescence comes puberty, and with puberty, right? So that's the maturing of the adrenal glands, maturing of the sexual glands, or the sex glands, I should say, right? So the testes and the ovaries. And so there's primary sexual characteristics, and then there are secondary sexual characteristics. And so, like for instance, in girls, that's where breasts and hips develop, and with boys, that's where the voice will deepen. They begin to have, like for instance, facial hair. And then menarche is the beginning of menstrual cycles in puberty, and that's usually around 12 to 13. Although some recent research shows that it's probably starting a little earlier, which is kind of interesting. And then spermarche, which is the first ejaculation for boys, which is around 13 to 14 years old. And then earlier, we also talked about growth spurts, which start with girls around 8 or 9, boys around 12, somewhere around in those ages. And girls will usually reach their adult height by age 16 on average, and boys will reach their adult height by around age 17. Although you can still grow a little bit more after that, but for the most part, the height you're at around that age, probably not going to get much taller. And then I did talk about this earlier too, and here it is showing up again. Remember, brain maturation and continues into the early 20s. Actually, around 25 is the current age that most scientists agree with at this point. And that is with the development of the frontal lobe in particular, which is important during this stage. And what's interesting with the maturation, I'm going to use my laser pointer here. It really is kind of like a top to bottom thing. It's like the frontal lobe is like the last area of the brain to actually mature. So the brain is almost like growing or maturing in this direction, which is actually how, when you're a fetus, that's kind of how it forms too, right? So from the most basic to the actual cerebral cortex. And remember that the frontal lobe is responsible for judgment, for impulse control, and for planning. And when you think of judgment, impulse control, and planning, this explains, or can explain, why many adolescents engage in increased risk-taking behavior and emotional outbursts, mainly because this area is still maturing. And remember, part of that maturation process is pruning, so that we talked about earlier. And then with cognitive development in adolescence, excuse me, mainly that thinking is characterized by the ability to solve hypothetical problems, design, plan, build a structure. They have the ability to reason logically. And some researchers believe that this is due to an increase in the mental capacity, right? They're developing new skills. And then other researchers say, well, yes, but it's also due to increases in processing speeds and efficiency. In other words, that they're improving existing skills. And it's probably a combination of the two. And then cognitive empathy is the ability to take the perspective of others and to feel concern for others, right? And this is shown to increase during adolescence and is an important part of the social problem solving and also to avoid conflict. And when we were talking about like Erickson's stages of development, right? One of the things that we talked about was identity versus role confusion. Here's another example of some of that psychosocial development, right? That he talked about. Who am I? Who do I want to be? You know, they may or may not adopt the roles that parents expect for them. They may develop identities that are in opposition to their parents, but more aligned with their peer group, which they spend a lot of time with. And in this situation too, during this time, peer relationships become central in their lives, right? And according to Erickson, adolescents who are in identity versus role confusion stage, teens may experiment while trying to figure out their identity, right? So I always say, what's a teenager's job? That's their job. And so some of the stuff that others may find off-putting, like their behavior and stuff, that's them working it out. That's their job. And in parent-child relationships, you know, warm, healthy parent-child relationships have been associated with better grades and fewer behavioral issues in school. Then there's emerging adulthood, which begins at around 18 years of age and goes into the mid-20s. And the identity exploration here is focused on work and love, for example. And then the question here is, why are people taking longer to grow up, so to speak? And mainly this is a product of Western culture and the times we live. People are living longer, allowing them extra time to start their career and family. Higher levels of education are required for a lot of careers. And then there's a higher cultural value placed on taking time to explore options. So that's some of the items that have been identified as to why this may be occurring. And then physical development, right? Early adulthood, 20s to 40s, you know, physical abilities are at their peak. By middle adulthood, beginning in your 40s, physical decline is gradual. Skin loses elasticity. That's when you begin to notice those crow's feet. Visual acuity decreases. Women experience menopause. Both men and women begin to gain weight. Hair thins. And then, of course, late adulthood, skin continues to lose its elasticity. Reaction time slower. Muscles strength diminishes. And the other senses, right? Smell, taste, hearing, vision all decline. Now, these can also be ameliorated by exercise, nutrition, living an active lifestyle. And then cognitive development. So there's two types of intelligence that we're going to talk about here. Now, first one is crystallized intelligence. And what crystallized intelligence is, this is the information, strategies, skills, things that we learn through experience that really remains steady or improves over time. And then fluid intelligence is information processing abilities, right? So our ability to reason, it affects our, it's our memory. These things begin to decline throughout early to middle adulthood, right? So crystallized intelligence improves, fluid intelligence begins to decline, right? Then there's psychosocial development. We continue on. So some of the items that are focused on in this area is, employment, well-being, job satisfaction, having contact with other people, having it be interesting, that kind of stuff. And then relationships and well-being, positive influences, having a stable marriage, having children. Notice in parentheses, it's initially stressful, but rewarding as time goes on. And then socio-emotional selectivity theory that states as we get older, our social support and friendships dwindle in number, but do remain as close, if not more close, than in earlier years. That's a And then the last thing we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to show you a quick video, and then I know we're running over a little bit. We're going to go on break, and then we'll come back and start chapter 10. But I kind of wanted to talk about death and dying. And I also wanted to talk about the 5 stages of grief. And there's really 2 really good videos. One is a clip from Oprah that I'm going to show you, which means I will probably have to stop the recording for that too, because I'll probably have copyright issues with it, and then restart it afterwards. And then there's a full-length video, and I believe I've already put it up in Canvas. Now you're not going to be tested on it, but if you have time to watch it, it's a really cool video called The Last Lecture. And you're about to meet through this video, through the Oprah clip, the professor who did the last lecture, which is actually, and he'll explain what last lecture means, that it's a tradition to do a last lecture. And well, he'll explain it. I don't want to, he'll explain it. But let's talk about the 5 stages of grief. And those are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. And that, most people go through all 5 of these. And people can also get stuck in a stage of grief. And grief can also, and we'll talk about complicated grief in the therapy section at the end of the semester. But she came up with these ideas about, when on death and dying, when people first get it, that's like, no, that can't be, right? And then the next emotion they feel is anger, like they're angry that this is happening, right? And then the bargaining stage is kind of like, well, if you let me live. Now this is for people that originally this was for people, I believe, that had cancer. I can't remember. It just went out of my head. But they were given a diagnosis where they knew they were going to be dying. But these also happen for people that have experienced death. People also experience these stages of grief. Then there's depression, and then the last, right? They get depressed, they're sad, and then finally they move into acceptance. And what's important about acceptance is, accepting the loss doesn't mean we're not going to miss our loved ones, right? We will miss them. But what acceptance does is we're now able to carry on with life where the loss isn't debilitating. It doesn't hold us back. We can leave the house, that kind of stuff. So acceptance doesn't mean, I just want to stress this, that that you're done, and that you're not going to miss the person, or even celebrate them on anniversaries or their birthdays, right? So, all right, so I'm going to stop the video. I'm sorry, the recording, just because I don't want the copyright issues, and then I'll play the next video, and then we'll go on break. Okay, so that was the clip from the last lecture, and as I was just stating a minute ago, and I'm sorry I did not record the discussion. Thank you guys for participating in that discussion. But the last lecture is a wonderful video to watch. So if you ever get a chance to do that, I highly recommend it. And that will conclude part 2 of chapter 9. So we're going to go on break, and I'm going to stop this recording. But don't go anywhere just yet. Announcement, and then